This is Delhi. Please stand by for our next program. This is All India Radio. In our national program of talks tonight, we bring you a panel discussion entitled Telling Tales, Children's Literature Today. The panelists are Jaya Bhattacharji Rose, International Literary Publishing Consultant, Editor and Academician; Umaima Ehtasham, Curriculum and Digital Pedagogy Specialist; Shinibali Mitra Saigal, Senior Editor, Leading Publishing House; and Renuka Narayanan, columnist and author, who initiates and moderates this panel discussion. Telling Tales, Children's Literature Today.
Good evening and welcome to the National Program of Talks on AIR. I'm Renuka Narayanan and I'm moderating this particular session, which is on children's literature in India and how it's grown and developed. With us this evening are Jaya Bhattacharji Rose, who has been working in publishing for over 30 years with a special interest in children's literature. And then we are very pleased to have Shinibali Mitra Saigal, who is working with a well-known publishing house since the last 4 years and is an editor. And also with us is Umaima Ehtasham, who works for a NGO that reaches out to underprivileged children, and she's in charge of commissioning and developing and presenting very focused, socially conscious stories for children. So there we are. I'd like to begin by a short review of what it was like with children's books after independence. I think a lot of us would agree that we had the usual Western fare, that's Enid Blyton, Richmal Crompton, graduating to Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys. And the Indian side, in English, came from the Amar Chitrakatha comics, from children's editions of the Panchatantra, and stories from the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Jaya, could you tell us what it was like and what you recall as highlights of this journey, the initial 2-3 decades?
Well, I mean, from what one has mapped in children's publishing is that for a long time we were getting books because of various exchange programs, because of the food program, etc. A lot of the books were coming in for children's literature from abroad. And there were these productions. Remember that globally, this was post-war years. So globally, post-war production for books was undergoing a massive transformation. Suddenly, the Richmal Crompton kind of books, which were just, on very low grade but excellent stories, low grade paper, and the alternative were the Golden House books, which were produced during the Second World War and are continuing to sell. I think they've sold 2 billion copies so far. We were in India inheriting and getting a lot of these books. And because of the Soviet Union, we were getting a lot of excellent books in translation. And they were not necessarily books in translation just from Russia, but they were from all the member countries of the Soviet Union as well as other parts of the world. And they were very beautifully translated.
I remember those.
They were beautifully translated, beautifully illustrated, extremely affordable, and they were good. And seeing that trend, and of course, then all the rest of it we had Anant Pai, Uncle Pai as he was known, he started the Amar Chitrakatha. And then we had these models appearing. We had these alternatives appearing because he was enamored by the massive comic boom which was happening in America. And at that time, IBH and all had been approached to license these comics.
This would be around the 70s, right?
Yeah, I mean, around the 70s, then they realized that apart from licensing, which of course they were exploring, he was invited to come on board. He decided, why not come up with our own version?
This is really interesting. Shinibali, do you recall a similar flow to what Jaya has just described when it came to children's books?
Yes, it's very interesting because while growing up, I remember, of course, reading a lot of Enid Blyton. And this is, I'm talking about reading habits now. What did I read while I was growing up? Of course, it was Enid Blyton. In school libraries, we also managed to read C.S. Lewis. In the Indian context, it was Amar Chitrakatha, like Jaya rightly said, and it opened up a world of history, and it made history so accessible. I mean, even it just translated the text for you in very simple visual form. Then there were the NBT, National Book Trust, and CBT books, which got some excellent writers like Leela Mojumdar to write these wonderful stories, and they were not just folk tales. You also had original writing which were from particular regions, which told you about the culture, and there was a lot of adventure happening there. Of course, the quality was very different from the way we see picture books today. It's evolved tremendously in the last 10 years particularly.
National Book Trust was set up under the HRD ministry, I think in 1952.
1952.
And with the specific mandate to produce specifically children's literature,
Yes.
and to be simultaneously translated into 14 languages.
Yes.
I'd like to ask Umaima here at this point, when you were growing up, did you ever read any books by the National Book Trust? Did they ever come your way?
I actually did not.
I figured. Because we like to keep saying NBT, but actually their outreach was very limited.
Yes.
So that is why I was interested to know what Umaima grew up reading.
Right.
You're in your 20s, right?
Yes.
Yes. So please shoot.
So what I grew up reading was more of scholastic books and a lot of stories around like these courtyards and Birbal stories and Tinkle, Champak. These were like more accessible, easy to read comics and stories of Supandi, what all of us were more interested and inclined in. Though Ruskin Bond was a writer that I was really interested in, and The Blue Umbrella was something that I really loved reading. So everything that we're discussing right now is very different to what I experienced as a child.
There you go. I just want to say this because we tend to romanticize the trajectory, the official trajectory of children's writing.
Coming
But
to that,
in actual fact, what children read and imbibed through the printed word was very different, as Umaima in her 20s has just told us.
I'm going to add over there. I was just coming to that because when I was talking about National Book Trust, and the Children's Book Trust also was started by Shankar around the same time, and these were the two trusts which did phenomenal work. They laid the ground for children's literature in India. Yeah, and they did. And then there was Target, which came up. Yeah. And these were, and the model which the Children's Book Trust offered of subscription packs and giving you a bundle of books from their front list was, I think for us, it was one of the most exciting things to receive in our thing.
So this is an interesting angle to the interconnectedness of the history of children's books in India. Shinibali, you mentioned Target. I'd love to hear what your impressions were of Target and its particular place in this history of children's books in India.
I'm going to talk as a reader because it's something I grew up reading.
This was in the 80s, right?
This was in the 80s, of course. And it was very interesting because it just, the stories were very real, and there wasn't a lot of it wasn't moralizing, it wasn't talking down to you, which has plagued a lot of our writing. It still plagues a lot of our writing.
I endorse that.
So, kind of talking down to children, the language being very infantile. Target didn't have that. It was very conversational, and it carried a spectrum of stories which were very interesting. You had animal stories, you had a lot of adventure, and I think it spoke in our language. Growing up at that point as a teenager, it was a magazine that spoke to you.
Why do you suppose it went defunct? In the 90s, I think.
Yeah, I think
after a 20-year run or a 15-year run.
I think a lot of it also had to do with that reading itself, I think, went down a bit, and reading habits also changed.
I think it was more that the environment was no longer conducive for the survival of Target, because Target was an excellent magazine and it should be revived. But the transition that we were going through in the 90s was phenomenal. And what happened with the publishing industry reflects what happened in the country worldwide.
Color TV came in
Yeah,
82.
yeah,
So
of
many,
course.
so much passive information
Absolutely.
competition.
And 92, even your,
Cable
cable
TV.
television
Yes.
comes in.
Cable television came in for the first time.
Umaima grew up with that.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking, do we also feel that the, how you say, demise of reading
Yes.
also came through because of the intervention of internet? And
I think so,
all of these
greatly.
other
Massively.
technology.
I think we'd all agreed on that.
In fact, if you today total up the number of minutes people spend scrolling on their smart devices or on their computers, they are, by today's reckoning, the statistic may change a few years down the line. By today's reckoning, we are losing at least 2 years of our life, day and night, constantly, just to scrolling on devices.
So the future is all yours, Umaima, when you're doing digital stuff which people are seeing on their phones.
And since we are talking about digital landscapes and publishing and the transition, I won't say there was a demise. I think there was a slump in reading, because the fact is that one of the things which happened when product lines, in a sense, for children's literature diversified, children's literature, if I may say so, in the 1990s was not considered a distinctive market on its own.
It wasn't big enough, considered big enough.
It was not considered big enough. The perception existed. Around a little later, I wrote the first book market report on India. Even at that time, the children's book market was not recognized as a specific market. Then,
when did it take off?
It took off in around 2003 or 2004.
Are you in tune with that, Shinibali, as a books editor?
Yes, of course.
What brought about the change? Why did it take off in 2003 or 4?
I think it was waiting to happen. I mean, and that's what I feel, because it starts with, a particular publishing house, which, you start with picture book. And one of the publishing houses which kind of started this picture book trend, we had Ruskin Bond. When you spoke that you read Ruskin Bond, I read Ruskin Bond as well. I think he's been there for the last 40 years. All of us have read him. So that hasn't changed. In fact, certain authors still exist. But I think a lot of things changed with the picture books coming in.
This is where I'd like to ask Umaima, how you commission. What do you tell people when you ask them to write stories for you?
So the kind of work that we do, we try to bridge and bring in voices of students. So we are saying that while there are a lot of these stories that already exist and we would want to bring that to children, we also feel that it is important for students to write their own stories. And for students to connect with artists and build these new narratives and build alternative narratives to existing social issues.
This is very interesting. Can you give us an example of alternative narratives?
One of the ways or one of the products that we've developed is Gen Earth, where we are talking about how climate change could be introduced to students. And there we are including a lot of these folk tales written by established artists, and we are creating digital versions of it, like animations of it, and then asking students what they feel about climate change and how they are introduced to it.
So this is children writing about themselves for other children.
Yes. That based on their own experiences from around the world.
This sounds very different.
Change makers.
Yes.
So children become the change makers and they write about their experiences.
But you have editors for this.
We do collaborate with a lot of artists, editors. We give our resources out to publishing agencies as well to see if they hold true for the times and for fact checking and all of that.
This strikes me as quite a novel development, that it's come, instead of adults writing for children, there's also now the area where children are writing about children for children. Jaya, you were going to say something. You wanted to say something.
2 things. One is I'm going to respond to this about writing for children writing for themselves as a thing. But in terms of picture books, again, because I map publishing and I have been doing it for a long time and I'm familiar with the business, picture books are actually a very technically specific and a very expensive commodity to create. But what has been interesting is that in 2003, 2004, when certain platforms started coming up to devise specific picture books, it's a great idea. It has taken off. They adhere to the, free copyright, etc.
Not necessarily
not
the
necessarily.
free copyright ones.
No.
There are many who are doing very innovative work.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is the reason why it erupted then was primarily by then we had 15 years of the liberalized economy, and for the first time we were noticing that families, there were two income generating people. So there was, for the first time, there was disposable income available to buy literature for children. Till then, the notion was that we have only a certain amount of household budget and that has to be spent on education.
I think people who encouraged reading didn't care much about the budget, because you had lending libraries, you had the school library, and you were given books on your birthday. So we must remember that part of our history.
But they didn't form a market. They didn't form a sufficient market.
That's right. But so that is why we went to Western books.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you, as a children's book editor and publisher, what kind of content did you start generating from 2003 or 4 or whenever it began?
So the thing is, initially when we started, we got into the publishing business, the idea was to reach the last mile child. And what's interesting is that Jaya mentioned that it's an expensive proposition, which is very true. But our idea was to give them access, and it was linked to literacy. Initially, it was linked to literacy.
Bravo.
That how do we create books that there were a lot of books which were academic, but how do you create books that were very Indian in nature, which were visual, which didn't have morals, which didn't have no morals, no religion, but very diverse. Yet it was so affordable that you couldn't even imagine how affordable it was.
What were they priced at?
30 rupees till even 2 years ago. And now it's, our most expensive book is at 50.
Amazing.
So it started that way. And what's interesting is, so we are a kind of bridge between what Umaima does and what Jaya does, because what happens with us is that we are a traditional print publishing house, but we have a massive digital arm. I mean, it's an access to across the world.
Wonderful.
And from the beginning, languages has been our focus. So over 250 languages on our platform.
Amazing.
And it's growing, and these are indigenous languages. I mean, languages you can't even imagine. And over a period of time, what's happened is, and it's not just the publishing house I work for, the landscape of not just picture books. What's interesting is that the kind of topics that are being touched upon.
This is where I'd like to ask Umaima.
Yes.
What are the kind of topics that children writing children's literature touch upon? Please tell us a bit about some of those stories.
Everything, in fact. I feel like a lot of times we undermine what students might be talking about or would be interested in, and we feel primarily they would be writing about fantasy or fiction, but it's everything from the education system to social justice to climate change to gender and identifying how gender dynamics play in their own household. So there's this one incident which actually has inspired a lot of these students, where Supriya, who's one of our students engaged in our programs, she has written, the walls of the school are high that only the bricks outside can see the world.
Oh dear.
And she talks about how limiting the education system and the classrooms that she's engaged in right now are. And that has inspired hundreds of students, and she has spoken on then across the globe. And these are the kind of stories that we would want to bring out.
How old is Supriya?
She is now in class 12th.
Okay.
When she wrote this, she was, I think, in class 9.
Very interesting. Do you remember any other incidents that you'd like to tell us about?
There are a lot of them. In fact, there is Muskan, who has written about her relationships with her mother and how that evolves. There's, I'm forgetting the name, but there are two young ladies who have written about how everything in this world has a price. Mol Bhav is the name of that story.
That's very perceptive coming from a young child.
Yes.
How old is this writer?
They are still in class 11.
Oh, I see a resonance with the Panchatantra here. The teenage audience that's becoming worldly wise.
But if I may add over here, we actually do a lot of these writing workshops with the children. It is mind-boggling the kind of fascinating stories and the perceptive stories that the children are writing. And all these stories are being published in a print form. They'll be printed, anthologized, made available, distributed. And at the same time, I'm teaching as an associate professor, and my students, they are writing essays for me. And when I get them to write, when I see the transition from childhood to adult, they're just at the cusp of adulthood. So many of these stories, which you have already mentioned, emerge again. They still don't have the complete techniques and the frameworks.
The writerly skills.
They're writerly skills, but it is fascinating to hear them talk for themselves, talk about themselves and for their audiences.
At this point, I see, if I review what we've spoken about so far, Jaya's given the long history in terms of developments in the country that impacted on children's literature. You have told us, Shinibali, about the kind of effort it takes to reach out again and through different media, so that you are a bridge between what Jaya is describing and what Umaima has described. And Umaima, I see, is the young activist who is exploring new ways to connect because her interest is in her training and her work experience is in education. She's worked with other NGOs before and rural platforms, and so she has a very focused interest in pushing this agenda of reaching children, from underprivileged backgrounds who need access not only to stories to feed their own imagination, but also to express themselves.
Right.
With the concept that with the functional concept that everybody has a story to tell, and therefore it needs to come out also to better socialize us and help us become more expressive citizens, I imagine.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little more about, you told me you went to places like Dungarpur to work with tribal children. Now, tribal children come right outside the spectrum that we've been talking about so far. Can you tell us a little bit about the kind of stories that those children of India explored or enjoyed?
They had more of like folk tales and their own fables to discuss and talk about. And those were passed on since a lot of these access to resources was very limited. Therefore, it was more from family traditions and old women like having a chopal and students sitting together. Those were the kind of stories.
In that sense, everyone used to be just a grandmother away, as somebody said.
Right.
But in your case, in the case of your experience, it seems like they are closer to that tradition than a lot of city kids have become, maybe. What do you think, Shinibali?
The thing is, yes, ultimately it depends entirely on access. And if you don't have the access, then everything else, ceases to matter. And the fact is that even for city kids, of course, they have far more access, but we are talking about a certain kind of city kid. Not everybody.
With English-educated parents already.
It's not that even within the city everyone has access to books and interesting books. You have access to academic books. And that's where a kind of, I think a reading revolution can happen with more and more access.
May I say something here? Yeah. I think a reading revolution ought to happen, and it ought to happen soon. And I'll tell you why I say this. A little 9-year-old boy from Hindi-speaking environment has begun coming to me twice a week for English sessions. I had a look at his textbook and it was the most boring thing on earth. So I don't know how people expect to teach language through the English textbook, and I expect that all of you will have something to say about it because the content is so dull. So we're not even reading that. We're looking at other things. We're reading, probably I'm going to show him some of your stories and some of the things that I hope to access from the two of you. And expose him to all these other options so that his interest in language doesn't die right there at the age of 9. You had to say something.
Yeah, two things. One is that access to language and different kinds is because one of the things which is coming with children's literature is the grading, the age appropriate grading on the books. Whereas if you look at reading evangelists' testimonies, they say that they yearn to read books outside that bracketing.
Quite right.
Okay, secondly, my daughter began writing a book with Paro Anand when she was 8. It was published when she was 10.
Goodness.
It's an illustrated storybook, and it is incredible to see how the children respond, because it was the first time an established writer in India collaborated with a child.
That's lovely.
And you should see how they resonate.
Yeah.
Because they got that tenor right. You know?
So we're looking at a situation basically at the end of a very interesting historical progress, and we're looking at three things that are coming our way. One is the trajectory that children's writing has taken since independence. We're looking at the efforts of individuals to bridge the gap between sections of readership where access plays a key role. And we're looking at going beyond India in the sense of not only beyond our borders, but beyond the tight borders of the urban readership into the rural areas. We're looking at reaching the underprivileged children. The impression I get from listening to all of you is that the field of children's writing in India is truly awaiting its revolution, and so many factors have come into play here to hopefully encourage that and make the textbooks more interesting, make the outreach more interesting, make the products more interesting, the thoughts more interesting. Let's hope it all blossoms together. In conclusion, I'd like to ask all of you what each of you thinks about the future of children's literature. Umaima?
I would say that we need to start looking at students not just as consumers of information and stories, rather creators of stories, and give them the agency to create more, share their stories, talk about what matters to them in their lives.
Lovely. Shinibali?
I think, access is primary, and I'm happy that there are a diverse range of topics. Right now, we are creating books that talk about environment. It talks about dark topics, which we thought children couldn't access or even understand. We are talking about, all kinds of things. And I think if we give interesting kind of content to children, consumption patterns we will be able to veer them away from many other things. And I think the digital platform, we can't diss it. It is going to be the way to go forward, even with reading. It'll work in tandem with print. I think both together will just work very well to create a robust reading habit.
That makes a lot of sense. Jaya, what do you think?
I think that we should encourage the children to have the freedom to read. The freedom to read, and to read with unbridled joy, whatever they wish to, because children understand what is according to their age. If they get stuck, they can come back. Let them have fun.
Sounds good to me, and sounds like a positive take on the future. Thank you all so much for your interesting ideas and thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In our national program of talks tonight, the topic of discussion was Telling Tales, Children's Literature Today. The panelists were Jaya Bhattacharji Rose, International Literary Publishing Consultant, Editor and Academician; Umaima Ehtasham, Curriculum and Digital Pedagogy Specialist; Shinibali Mitra Saigal, Senior Editor, Leading Publishing House; and Renuka Narayanan, columnist and author, who initiated and moderated this panel discussion. Produced and presented by Naveen K. Gupta of All India Radio Delhi, this program came to you from the Delhi station of All India Radio.